Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, always was, always will be, Indigenous land. So we're here in Arizona Sunshine, a virtual reality video game modelled in Arizona. We're on a hiking trail which also happens to have quite a lot of zombies on it, this being a sort of post-apocalyptic zombie game. And we're here to discuss posthumanism, and I guess that post-apocalyptic zombie thing felt like a good environment to discuss some of these ideas within.
So what have we got to talk about? We're talking about, let me see if I can do on my hands.
Yeah.
We've got the ecological idea of posthuman, which is sort of thinking about a world, a post-Anthropocene world, right?
Yeah.
And we've got the idea of posthuman in sort of a Nietzschean sense, or sort of like the progression of the human condition.
Sorry, that was
that's
just
good.
In my view. Keep going.
So the idea that, the posthuman as where we will go, we're in transition, humanity will sort of like progress into something which is different from what from what the human condition currently is. So some of this discussion of VR and technology and how we engage with each other and how we engage with ourselves and understand ourselves and the world is that posthuman in the sense that, we are constantly changing what it means to be human, and the posthuman is this thing that comes in afterwards. What else have we got to talk about? We've got a few other things.
Yeah. Well, let's just start, I guess, the idea of coming together in a virtual reality game. That idea of the technological posthuman is something that interests me a lot, and the idea of us inhabiting this space as two avatars. So within this multiplayer game, our avatars are identical. They're arbitrary. There's no choice that we can make about how we look. Josh happens to have a hat on. I can't see myself at all, but I think I don't have a hat on.
You took your hat off.
Yeah. So as long as Josh retains his hat and I don't, then we'll get an idea of who's who. But that may change. But that, I guess, Josh, you probably have a lot to say about the avatar.
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting things about what is expected and what's accommodated by the avatar. The world is filled with, it's not homogenous. People have different bodies, and there's always been an issue with technology having a limited imagination of the diversity of lived experience. So, one thing you were saying before, that children just appear to be like running around like this.
Yeah, very
right?
little.
It doesn't do anything to accommodate the difference in height. This is obviously a very particular normative body that's represented here. And the general idea of games and the representation of people in games is what they consider neutral is actually just the sort of political default. You'd say, like, the male white body is the sort of default that you'd go for, and you just have to deal with the lack of imagination of the games. There is maybe an opportunity to subvert that to a certain degree. I mean, it's a little bit sad that the hat is the only... They realize that there's a need for a point of differentiation, but that extends only in this game to being able to put a hat on or a mask. You could kind of say that that's similar to capitalism in general. It doesn't really accommodate difference unless it's a sort of difference defined by consumer, whether you drink Pepsi or Coke.
Yeah. But I guess that makes me think of a game that came up in my research, which I've also played before, Rust.
Oh, yeah.
And Rust, you're a middle-aged, white, balding man who's naked, which I guess the developers saw as a default. But then within that body from my experience of it, that body, you couldn't really modify its volume or different things about it. But then the developers ended up randomizing the avatars so that you became just a complete roll of the dice, which, I guess creates a more diverse representation of bodies, but then it also flattens the idea of identity into something super arbitrary.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. There's it's kind of like a new age politics, identity politics, where it's the idea. We were talking like a little bit earlier around the idea of mind-body duality, and that's kind of that, that standard new agey mind-body duality where you're like, oh well, we're just this free-floating thing of energy, and the body doesn't really matter. It's not a defining feature of me, the essential me. And in the same way, like when you choose an arbitrary character, you're sort of saying, like, look, you as an identity, as a fundamental thing, is just inhabiting a particular body. And the problem with that is it's like, well, it ignores the fact. The only way that you can have that sense really is if your sense of who you are if it hasn't been pointed out to you that everything that makes you who you are in your worldview and how you feel about things hasn't been affected by who you are in the world. So it's kind of like a luxury that only someone who's in the sort of default position can harbor, that there's no connection between your body and your identity and who you are. Yeah. Everyone else is like constantly reminded of that. Yeah, there's a nice Australian philosopher, what's her name? Good Lord. Architecture of the Outside. It was really good. Who wrote that?
Elizabeth Gross.
Elizabeth Gross talked about that and this sort of idea of cyberspace. The original cyberspace manifesto that was written in the 90s is totally mind-body duality. They talk about how cyberspace is a world of rational, of intellect and rational thinking. And it's pretty much like that divide between all of this sort of bodily stuff and then the head in the jar. And the internet is a space for different heads in the jar to do their thinking and their like intellectual connection without in any way talking about, giving room for anything else. In some ways that's kind of exciting because when you're talking about the possibility of technology in a post-human context, you can say the great thing about new technologies or new ways of being in the world is that you can break free of like bigotry and particular models that hold you to a certain way of being. Like, for example, the internet, early days of it was an opportunity for people to meet communities, supportive communities that gave them an opportunity to live and freely express who they were in the world without fear of bigotry. Yeah. But then, you get 4chan and all these things, so there's a disconnect of these original ideas that might be oppressive about what it means to be human in a social context. And then that all feels like great and a freeing element of the technology, and then later on it sort of recalcifies into something like 4chan, where there's now an opportunity for this thing to reform as a monstrous, like ultra racist, awful, gore video watching. Some of these online forums, their idea of the posthuman is, transcending the human, is this idea that you don't feel emotional connection to human. They consider it a weakness to look at a picture of someone getting injured or killed and emotionally responding to that.
Yeah, I think another element. I'm just going to go over here.
There's a radio over there. It's good.
Another element of the posthuman, which I guess comes into that technology thing, which to me is quite interesting. It's the link between posthumanism and transhumanism. Mm-hmm. And I guess seeing transhumanism like a technological improvement on the human, whether you would see that as a form of posthumanism, like once you think that the human body needs to be augmented by technology, have you lost touch with what humanity is?
I'm always resistant to the idea of a linear narrative of progression.
Sorry. I can't, for some reason I can't hand it to you.
What is progress?
Yeah.
There is, to talk about that posthuman, that's why it's kind of interesting to talk about the monstrous that comes out of new technologies. Originally there was a lot of optimism and of course like this idea of democratizing speech and all that sort of stuff, and now what we see is the other side of it is fake news and propaganda and geopolitics that's based on very cheaply just confusing people and talking very easily creating narratives and rumors and things like that that mess up the world. There's no obvious idea that if you add these technologies it will become an improvement. It's a change. And that change can form as something it's monstrous, not necessarily a bad monster, not necessarily a monster in a sort of violent, brutal sort of sense, but it's monstrous in the sense that it's something which is monstrous, maybe let's say in the sense of a supernatural or it's a transformation of what it means to be human that can go either positive or negative, but not necessarily just as an idea of progress. So, if you remember people wearing the Google glasses, and they're like, wow, this is incredible, it gives us all of these new ways of working, but fundamentally the general take was it made you an asshole, because the new set of ways of being in the world that it brought with it were ways that gave you this privileged sort of perspective over other people, and it meant that you were sort of voyeuristically recording the rest of the world in a way which was an unbalanced power structure. All sorts of things came out of that made it basically being I don't know what to say other than being an asshole by wearing them.
Yeah.
Well, can you see there's like insects over there?
Where?
There, there's flies.
Where?
Over on the bridge.
Where? Flies.
Yeah, I just think around that dead body.
This one, oh no, that's not a body. I don't have any bodies in mine.
Oh.
Maybe they've decayed. Well, that was something I was thinking about, having played this game a bit in my own time. I don't recall ever seeing any animals or insects.
Oh.
Is that the first time you've seen insects? I guess I can hear crickets.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's heaps of flies, they're giant.
There is life. And yeah, I think a game like this also gets you thinking about the posthuman in terms of what, how the world might exist without humans inside it. Are you still eating? Your hands are
I just finished.
Okay. But yeah, and that for me is a very big part of my practice as an artist, thinking about posthuman in terms of approaches towards perception, thinking of decentering human perception, decentering, the visual form of perception as like a very mammalian human way of perceiving the world, and then trying to imagine like a phytomorphic perspective of plants, and all of those different approaches to how can we somewhat empathize with forms of perception of non-human beings.
And to what end is that? Would you consider that a politically motivated or directed thing to try and sort of re-privilege the non-human?
Yeah, I think definitely like moving away. I guess it's not just the human. I guess it's the individualized human. And there's elements of that where we go towards thinking in a more collective sense, or thinking in a more, maybe a less self-absorbed or selfish sense. So,
well, I mean, in that sense, this experience and most VR experiences like this are exactly the opposite. They're trying to give, we are plugged into a perspective of a human agent
Yeah.
within space.
But then VR is celebrated as the empathy machine. So
Yeah.
sorry, I know that would set you off. No, but I guess, so remember we went to that conference in February, the Brainless Cognition Conference
Mhm.
at Sydney University, and things, when you start really thinking about consciousness or cognition and what are the philosophical or practical limits of what consciousness or cognition is, and then you look at something like the slime mold, which is, in a single cell, there's some bullets in that car if you want some. Singularly, the slime mold is just a cell, but then when it comes together, that's where it has sort of higher order decision-making capacity or cognition capacity.
Ooh, I've got an exciting thing, because you could say, you were when we were sort of discussing what we were going to talk about, the possibilities of what we were going to talk about. You mentioned Nagel talking about that insight into what it feels like to be a bat.
Yeah.
And my comment on that was to sort of turn it around and say, well, I wouldn't say that we have personal, individual insight into what it means to be human, because as far as I'm concerned, it's your understanding of yourself is within the context of a society's understanding of not just you personally, but what it means to be human in general. The only way you can get insight is we use language to understand the world. That's entirely a social thing. How can you approach? We don't even understand our own emotions most of the time. It can take years to get insight from other people giving some, what does it feel? Why do you get angry when you get tired or when you haven't eaten? Often a lot of adults fail to have even personal insight into the fact that they're grumpy because they haven't eaten. That's such a straightforward one. But to talk about the slime mold and that sort of idea of, what it means to challenge that idea that we are individual these individual units of rational atomic agency in the world. And one problematic thing that's come out of technology is this model of the computer as a model for the human experience, human perception.
Yeah.
It's caused so much damage through psychology that computer science informed a model of, you're perceiving as this sort of inputs and then this data processing thing and It's just awful. The analogy totally falls flat and has never. It's basically a branding exercise in the field of computer science that's made it successful.
Yeah. I think, which I'm guilty of too. I feel like I'm often saying I don't have enough bandwidth to deal with that right now, or terms like that which are very computing based. Thinking about what it is to know the self and what it is to be conscious of humanness, I guess that gets me thinking about my meditation practice that sits outside of my creative practice, but maybe touches on it now and then. Okay.
Sorry, go on.
But yeah, my meditation practice, and maybe that's an interesting point too. So, when I've been meditating a lot, and going on a thing like a Vipassana, where you're silent for 11 days, and then really thinking. I guess you're firstly meditating for a lot of that time, and within the meditation process, hopefully achieving some form of enlightenment. And to think of enlightenment as a form of being as in touch with our humanness as possible, right? But then that point of enlightenment also leans towards a non-dual experience where you lose sense of the self and non-self, and you are leaning into a very non-individualized way of thinking. And yeah, I guess, to be human is to be as human as you can, to be in that point of enlightenment where you lose, you go through ego death, you lose sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it, just the animalistic side of us that's grumpy and doesn't know why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is another thing. If we're talking about the posthuman, it's not just what are the possible avenues of transition from what we consider the human condition at the moment, but also the fact that what it means to be human now and in the past, or what it means for something to be natural, and then technology to be a sort of augmentation of natural. All of that is political and religious and all that sort of. What are you doing?
I'm listening. I'm definitely listening. I'm not ignoring.
It looks like you're doing like that.
No, I'm thinking of something which we've discussed before, the cosmic mudra.
Oh.
And the fingertips. I can't touch.
Oh, yeah. We have talked
hand,
about it. Well, these ones, the index fingers, can go right through each other.
Yeah, but the my handsets in real life are touching, so they can't get right close.
So that idea that possible avenues of technology transforming humanity, and our concept of humanity, but what we consider nature and humanity has always been kind of dogma or politics or religious ideology and things like that. It's like there's no one has agreed to. It's always a point of contention. What humanity is always a point of contention. What inhumane, what inhuman is, what dehumanizing, like talking about the other in a way which reduces them to animals, is another thing. And then some discussions that say that all of those animalistic motivations are sort of the more deeply human and blah, blah, blah. You have the Enlightenment sort of side of things that always considered that very particular brand of Western abstract rational thought as the total epitome of human evolution, but also of what constitutes being human. So it's we're on a battleground even before we start talking about moving from the human into something else. All of those concepts have been literally the focus of battlegrounds, of thinking about how we should be in the world, or what to value about humanity, what to value about the human condition.
Okay, should we get up and the sun's nice up here.
Yeah, right behind the thing.
Good. Nice little bit of glare. So welcome to the old. I feel lightheaded. So welcome to the old Dutchman mine. You are just a few minutes away from a step back in time. So should we walk down here and see what's about to happen? Whoa, that guy really launched at you.
Yeah. Headshot.
Ammo.
How much have you got?
60.
Take this.
You'll just have to drop it. Thanks.
They come in a minute, don't they? Let me get in position.
They might.
So let's speculate. We could also talk very literally about this experience that we're having here and think about, what it would mean to have a world where the majority of our social interaction interpersonal interaction is being done through VR. And I think there's, we were having a little bit of a look at how the facial expressions were adjusting to the sounds that we were making. So you could be standing face to face, and your avatar would look like they were happy when you're laughing.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is kind of an extension of the emoji. It's there's a fair bit of expressivity in the tracked body, and that we can read. Wait, you're way over there. We can read some of that sort of intention and expressivity and emotional content in just the headset and the hands being tracked to the body.
Does it look like I'm sitting on this car?
It looks like you're kind of. Ooh.
Oh.
Oh.
Okay.
Ooh. I do like it when they do those big jumps. Did you want this hat here?
No, well, if... Oh, that looks like a good hat. Yeah.
The motorcycle helmet is pretty cool too.
Where's the motorcycle helmet?
It's
I
further
don't know
up.
if I can put that on. That's their hat. So I've got this hat on now.
Yep.
Cool.
There's always that problem of sort of the issues that we have with texting, where we don't have that sort of multi-level sort of set of different signals about someone's tone. And I think a lot of those things, the problem with VR and the problem with trying to build avatars and forms of communication is that the people who develop them can only build in the ability to communicate through things that they're aware of. Whereas if you're talking face to face with someone, there's a whole bunch of things that we're not aware of going on that are intuitive ways of understanding someone's emotion. And if we start to build ways of communicating that don't allow them, then we're just going to not have those channels of...
Josh over here.
Yep. Oh, cool.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's the fear. So we're on the Oculus Quest 1, which was about $700 for the cheaper one, was it?
Yep. $650 plus the case.
But now they're like $450.
Yeah, so
the Oculus Quest 2, which is great. It's aimed at a more accessible audience, but then it's also aimed at this very, I don't know, like I guess as an alternative for reality.
Yeah, well, Facebook, it being owned by Facebook is going really hard with trying to get people to use social VR. So I think their model of the future of VR is that people will use Facebook as their form of they'll use VR. Wait, what am I saying?
Not for more intellectual pursuits like shooting zombies.
The expectation is that your Facebook experience and your social experience will be kind of done through VR. And the reason why they're doing it is because they can do all this sort of tracking. If all of your socializing is done not in physical space but in VR, that just means that they can get all of the they can sort of capture everything. Capture more of your life. Ecology. What do we got to go on?
Yeah, well, no, I think we started to talk about it and got distracted. So we're thinking about the non-human forms of perspective, but then also a fundamental element of my thinking of the posthuman is, imagining a world without us, and
which is perfect to be in a post-apocalyptic. I love post-apocalyptic stories. But one element of that as well is another element of the very human concept of posthuman, because it's like there's a fantasy about how your life will change given if all of those sort of general structures of society break down, and it's you versus the world, and you don't have to. In some ways, it's kind of that monstrous post-human fantasy where, you know, the ethical rules that normally govern your life might break down, so you can sort of will to power. You take your, you know, I'm going to be the one that breaks into the whatever and takes all the guns and gets all the food and blah, blah, blah. Because those original rules don't exist, I'm going to be able to flourish in this new version of the world.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Oh. Yeah. But I guess that's the part where I was interested when I realized you could see bugs. I still can't see bugs. I can just hear them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like the way that, you know, we have all these plants just gently swaying around us. And there's a lot of ways in which it's kind of thinking of the world being better off without humanity. But then, you know, I guess that's also just a something to think about, kind of like a thought experiment rather than a realistic desire. And, you know, it's thinking about the organizations like the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, which talks, their slogan is live long and die out, which I think is fantastic. And it's not, you know, like, I guess to look at posthumanism in that sense, it's not a like suicidal end of humanity. It's saying we just live well, we don't procreate, and then in 80, 100 years, there's no humans. And that as a thought experiment for me, I think is interesting in the way that I approach natural environments and different ecosystems within my practice. And I guess that idea of the ecosystem, you know, the weakest link is often humanity. It's us. And as you said before, like, I guess there are now quite a lot of plants or animals or living things which are sort of dependent on human intervention for them to stay alive. Their existence is so compromised by humans that that's now the case, but then there's still the majority of it. Everything, you know, all these plants look pretty happy to me.
That, I think there's an interesting question that's built into that, what do you call it, extinction?
Voluntary human
extinction. Because that's also a question about nature. You know, Thomas Aquinas was a philosopher who was talking about ethics. And one of the things that he did was, you know, if he was born in a different time in a different context, then he would have used his sort of like, you know, his thoughtfulness to different ends. But what he was doing was trying to figure out what ethical behavior was according to a model of what, basically what was natural for him and what was good were things that fit into a biblical context. So, you know, you couldn't have sex for pleasure, basically wasn't within that. Sex had to be for procreation, otherwise it was unethical. And you could say it's kind of interesting as well as a post-human thing to say that that ethical or the moral framework that includes dying out is obviously plugged into a very different model to the idea of it being natural and sort of the necessary ends of living to procreate. You know, obviously there's just a fair number of religions that have got that don't really like the use of contraception, and you could sort of fairly cynically say that some of that is kind of like the natural meminess of the religion, that if your followers have lots of kids then it's going to be quite successful. But also ideas of like what it means to not be a breeder in any context, like in a sort of sexual orientation context, or just deciding not to have kids so that you'll live for a long and good life, and then not have your children, your progeny won't create some, because like really having kids is the worst environmental thing that you can do.
Yeah.
And then having a chihuahua is like the second worst. But
Yeah.
What you doing? I'm going to look at this piece of paper.
So what are we talking about? So
another thing that VR does.
Well, yeah, it helps us acclimatize. And so here we are, I've got shooting our guns, doing our thing. I haven't ever shot a gun before. And we're in this, we're literate to the first-person shooter thing, which, most teenagers are super literate in that. Most people, I think, have played a game where you shoot something. Like, people have played Doom for the last 30 years. How long's it for?
Yeah, it's been around for a while.
But then, I guess that is all just some light fun.
Well, I've talked in the past about how technology comes out of either porn or or military or warfare.
Yeah.
And VR obviously fits both.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's been a discussion. There's a book called On Killing, which talks about the sort of psychology behind killing someone in a warfare context. And it says that progressively over the years, as people have got better and better at training soldiers to be comfortable with the act of killing, it started off that you'd send people like Vietnam War, like apparently most of the American soldiers were aiming high, were deliberately aiming high because they didn't want to actually shoot someone.
Oh, that hit me.
Did it? Oh, sorry. But then they started doing things like they changed the targets for the training from just like the red circles into a human figure. And all of these things, they were deliberately trying to desensitize the soldiers from the wild and, let's say, hopefully, ambitiously natural discomfort with killing another person. And VR is part of that. We are now developing, it's as close as you can get to the experience of desensitizing yourself to shooting another person.
Yeah. So, I guess I've spoken in a bit more detail about what I think is a sense of posthumanism, which is unique. Not to say I'm unique, but unique to my understanding of that view.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess that topic of conversation came up because I feel like I mentioned posthumanism once to you just casually, and it became apparent that what you understood as posthumanism was very different to what I was thinking of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in that instance, if your elevator pitch of what you think posthumanism is very briefly, what is that?
Well, one of the things that I would think, your version seems to be this sort of an element of what I might call horizontal ontology, which is a deprivileging of the human. And when I think of posthumanism, I think of both like some, the Cyborg Manifesto and that sort of stuff, but also, this Nietzschean discussion of the Übermensch and transcending what it means to, transcending the current idea of human and becoming something different. And for Nietzsche, that meant casting off, Judeo-Christian moral systems to become something else. But through technology, there's that. It doesn't explicitly talk to that sort of Nietzschean idea, but libertarianism and some of these Silicon Valley ways of talking about the future kind of are accidentally or just sort of in parallel ignoring ideas of like what's a disruptive technology, what does society look like with the disruptive technology that just completely decimates labor rights and things like that and makes it totally neoliberal free market stuff. Just a sec. Shimmy, we're just recording at the moment. We're doing audio. That's good. I like the balance. It looks balanced on mine.
But I guess what you said, horizontal ontology.
Horizontal.
I guess, is that similar to, along the lines of object-oriented ontology and the hierarchy of, different forms of non-human perception in terms of object-oriented ontology? I'm
not very well versed with object-oriented ontology, but the horizontal ontology is just basically there's no privileging of any. It's not like human existence is privileged over anything else. So it's looking at like microorganisms, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And I suppose from there we can talk. I mean, if you're going to combine the two, talking about technology, talking about transcending traditional moral codes and ethics, if you're talking about a horizontal ontology and an ecology, a non-human centered ecological thinking, then, whereas humans, our survival isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all of that ethical system, which goes back to your extinction sort of thing.
I follow some of the writings of Timothy Morton, who speaks about object-oriented ontology. And Morton also talks about things like the hyper-object, which we've discussed before. And maybe that was something that I was thinking about within this work, within the idea of different hyper-objects. Climate change as a hyper-object, we've spoken about the internet as a hyper-object. And then, creating this work in October 2020, we're in a situation where maybe, thinking about the current conditions of coronavirus or, these sort of viruses as hyper-objects, somewhat. I don't know if it would totally qualify as that, but then thinking in the context that we're in, where the zombies that we're up against have, boils on their bodies that are fluorescent green, and obviously, even though they haven't described what the backstory of this specific zombie apocalypse is, it looks like there's a viral element to it. And that idea of the virus that is motivating these zombies maybe goes into a sort of a non-individualized collective idea of this thing that is just trying to breed and spread itself into other host bodies. And, like the virus becomes a posthuman entity.
Yeah. What what I like about talking about the possible monstrous manifestations of posthumanism is that it doesn't beg the question, in the sense it doesn't try and answer the question in the way that it asks the question about the morality of it. It doesn't say that this thing is implicitly good or this thing is implicitly bad. It sort of says, well, it can go either way, and it's part of the responsibility of talking about this to unpack and discuss and kind of put your allegiances down for why you would say that something is bad or good or desirous or not. So you could, one thing that I like about the zombies and the idea of this kind of post-apocalyptic context is that the monstrous, that post-human monstrous is always like kind of scary for if you're anchored in the current. The world, we're in a precarious world. The sort of challenges that we're facing are ones that, I've noticed kind of kicking around and seeing how people respond to sort of requirements to wear masks and things like that, that it seems like people are more afraid of the unfamiliar than they are of the, this abstract concept of change and the necessity to move beyond your comfortable space is more frightening than the very concrete material danger of getting a virus. And it's kind of nice to think that if we don't make that moral judgment of zombies, they're different, they're scary because they're unknown, they're scary because they're different to us. So I guess the thing that brings the different versions of posthumanism together, that sort of ecological, like post-Anthropocene, and the kind of Nietzschean sort of moving beyond traditional ideas of morality.
Mm.
You know, that sort of Nietzschean thing of the Übermensch is kind of like, you know, a lot of people sort of read it as being really selfish and solipsistic and only looking after yourself. And it's not necessary. A lot of teenagers who read it take it that way. It's like, yes, this will to power, I'll do whatever I want. It's not necessarily, but the main thing it's saying is like challenging those sort of traditional Judeo-Christian moral systems and saying that we can move to something beyond that. And that, you know, might be a good point here to bring those two things together to say, well, you know, with that idea of living a long life and then dying out, one way of questioning that human moral system is to say, well, the zombies here might be a better moral position than the humans in this post-apocalyptic world.
Well, they've evolved to be more suited to this world.
Yeah. We're fighting. It's hostile environment. Every moment is being is of fear and and just trying to make it.
Yeah.
Whereas they don't need to drink or eat, and they can shamble around forever.
Yeah.
And do their job. Well, and you could also say, like, the traditional reading of the zombie is that some of the thing that we find horrific about the human is that it is uncanny. It has that. We read a human body and a human figure as having an internal agency, and, you know, through analogy, the same way that we look at normal figures, when we look at a human figure, we project all of these things like an internal agency. And the reason why we get creeped out, that element of the uncanny, is that we read it, but it's not there. It's like
one thing I always found problematic about the uncanny valley, especially, was that the term was coined, I think, in the 70s.
Yeah.
Right? And it really was just one paper that everyone references back to. And I'm sure it exists, but I haven't read a lot about contemporary interpretations of the uncanny valley, because there's one thing to talk about, you know, bad silicon simulations of humans in the 70s. And the headspace that humans were approaching that in, and the way that we are so much more open to artificial intelligence or simulations of humans now, and the technology as well being much more effective. But
there's still, I mean, some of the AI stuff is deeply creepy at the point, because you can present things which are obviously not trying to be an emulation of human. And we, you know, there's an argument that one reason why the sort of Japanese robotics sort of culture is the way that it is because of a tradition of animism. And the idea that inanimate object has got a soul or an internal, you know, being is totally built into that view of the world. So, you know, your toaster, a rock, your computer, blah, 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 that goes without saying. So having a robot or whatever isn't a massive extension from that. But there are, you could say two things. One is that people have been designing, trying to accommodate the idea of uncanny valley so that they don't make mistakes, although every so often something comes out which is terrible. But I do think it's got some purchase, and some of that is like, it's not just talking about when technology tries to be human, it's talking about things like the creepiness of a dead body, or, you know, or the history of zombies as a genre, you know, particular ideas of horror that have existed long before we really tried to create sort of, you know, automata that tried to pretend to be a human. But what we've got here is something which is entirely a technological artifice. These avatars, you know, we could be in different parts of the world, or the other person, you know, but because there's a sort of minimalism to what we can see, and then there's the expressivity of the hand gestures and everything, you can read the other person in it. You can hear the tone of the voice, you can read the other person in the gestures. And especially, when you're doing things like grabbing something to eat, you can even imagine what the person's actual body is doing in space, totally separate from the avatar. You can see that sort of thing going on.
Yeah.
But, that reading of the zombies is us going like, it's lost its humanity. We don't really read it as like, this is now a colony for a new set of exotic microorganisms that are much better suited to exist in the world. The danger there is that you can get a bit sort of, eco-fascism, and be like, the ecology can take control and that's better, that's morally good, that humanity dies out and that the animals and plants take over. Whereas I suppose what we should be saying is that it's ambiguous. And the thing that I like about that reading of the monstrous, or the potential for the monstrous in Posthuman, is that it's not saying one way or another this is good or this is bad. There's an ambiguity to it. It's like it can manifest in one way or another. And it kind of sets you up for the next job of having the conversation about. All it says is not necessarily our conception of humanity as it stands is something that's natural and good by Dana, the fact that it's natural. There are other things, and we're not going to presuppose whether it's, linear progress of technology that is always necessarily good, and we're not going to presuppose that it's always necessarily bad.
Yeah.
We're not even necessarily in a position to make that judgment because we're coming from this human perspective.
Yeah. I think this is something that, for me, brings me back to what I was talking about with meditation and the idea, a lot of what you're saying, and I think we both have, because we're debating it, we're looking at it in a lot of different sort of value judgment ways, and we're both quite pragmatic in the way that we evaluate things. But in a meditation perspective, you're not going to make those judgments. Things aren't good or bad, they just are. And I don't know how that totally sits with, like, I feel like it's human to judge and to evaluate, but then there's, within that sort of, striving for an enlightened perspective through meditation, the zombies taking over is neither good nor bad, it just is.
Yeah, so I kind of like that idea of allowing, of responding to the change with an open mind, I suppose. Well, that kind of sounds terrible, because it's like there are some things that, let's see, but I like the idea of sort of allowing the unknown, and sort of like, see, the difficulty here is that obviously some things that could sort of coalesce and manifest in a post-human context are awful. It's dehumanizing, it's bigotry, a level of cruelty that is considered normally inhumane and beyond human capability. What are you doing with your thumbs? They're all over the place.
Oh, I'm touching the buttons.
How do you do that? That looks amazing.
If you just rest your fingers on the buttons, they're quite sensitive, the controllers, the way you can do that. Well, I guess that's always been, for me, that's always been an issue with philosophy and feeling. Philosophy exists for people who have the luxury of time and wealth and different things that allow them to sit and think. And I guess, maybe that this is an element of that when the zombies start attacking us, there's no way I can think about whatever we're thinking about. In a world like this, it's pretty unrealistic that we're sitting here talking about what it means to be posthuman.
Well, if you were actually in this situation, and you were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, the idea of making a decision up against, it's kind of dark, to end like that. I like the idea of having the zombies overwhelm us and to talk about a response to change in that way. But Yeah, I don't know. But then to say things like, taking agency when to decide to become to actively. Oh, that's an alright thing to say. Like, if you look at the situation that we're in here, this post-apocalyptic world where there's, you're constantly being attacked. It's a hostile environment. And yet, with nothing, just purely being, the zombies are flourishing. Then you could say that actually being a zombie is a better adaptation to this current situation. I mean, the worst thing for the zombies is the humans who are having a hard time dealing with the transition. They're the biggest threat. Whereas, like, in this, who knows what has happened, but the zombies are able to carry on without putting too much effort into it.
Well, then if we go back to Nagel and, what it's like to be a bat, can we understand what it's like to be a zombie?
Well, we're about to find out.
Perhaps.
And then that will decide.
Your gun is floating there. I don't know if you dropped it.
Oh, yeah, I did. Where is it? Oh, no, it's still floating there.
You've got it in here. Okay.
Yeah.
So where are we going to try and defend ourselves from?
Just, let it...
So how many bullets do you have? Because there's lots in the back of this car once we open it.
I have 120. Oops.
Okay. You take that one.
Thank you.
Where do they all come from, though?
From there.
Let's get away from that thing. But
this seems like a nice place. Come by the bins. That
Fine.
seems... And away from the barrel as well.
They're not going to climb over the back there?
I don't know. I'll watch the map. I'm not really seeing... Oh, there's a runner. Ooh. No, they're not climbing over the back.
Oh, to my left.
Ooh.
Oh, drop my gun. Okay. Oof.
People coming from everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh. You're right.
What? We died.
Really?
Yeah.